Hello. We're back. I hope by this time you have been able to watch the video for week 1 and read the blog and also do the worksheets leading up to week 2. I feel like it's really helpful to do the worksheets before the week that we discuss them so that you have time to dig into the scriptures yourself and see what they say and see what God wants to teach you personally before you hear what I have to say and what God taught me through that. I think it really helps to know what the Bible says for yourself before you hear teaching. So if you've had time to do it this week, you've been reading along with us about the establishment of a human king on the throne. First, I want to do a quick recap of last week. If you recall, we defined what a kingdom was and how God worked to establish his kingdom on earth in the way that humans would recognize. They needed 4 things. They needed to have land, which God promised them to be in the area where Israel is now. God had promised them that land. They needed people. God chose a family for himself, Abraham's line, to be his people. They needed a law to be a kingdom, and God established that through the law that he gave Moses after they exited Egypt and were preparing to enter into the land that God had promised them. He said, we're about to go into this kingdom. Here are the rules you need to follow. And then 4th, you need really the first thing, most obviously a king. You need a sovereign. And God was saying, that is me. And he had been working to prove to them that he could be trusted with this role as their king. He had protected them. He had brought them out of slavery. He had fought armies for them. Again, he established the law code. He was giving them land. He was doing everything he needed to say that I am the sovereign over this kingdom. So if you recall, they entered into the promised land, and at that point, they entered into a time of judges. The judges were men and women that God had raised up to bring Israel out of times of trouble. They had gone into a cycle where they would disobey God, disregard God's commandments, and God would send an army, typically, to conquer them, to crush them, and they would cry out to God and say, we're so sorry, please come help us. God would, because he's a forgiving and loving God, and he wants his people for himself, and he wants the opportunity to show them that he is for them. So he would come and he would rescue them through a judge. He would raise up a judge to defeat the armies around them and to defend his people. And the people would be so grateful for a very short time. Usually it was only about 1 generation before everyone kind of forgot again who God was and what he was capable of, and they would again begin to live their lives in rebellion. There is a repeated refrain through the book of Judges that says, in that time there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Of course, we have learned that that is not true. There was a king in Israel, but they failed to recognize that. So we enter into the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel was chosen by God to be a judge and a priest over his people. And he ended up being the transition between the era of judges and the era of the kings. Of course, Samuel did not grow up knowing that that's what he would be. When he got to be an old man, he established his 2 sons as judges over Israel, and they did not follow the ways of God. And Israel said, we're done with the judges. We don't want this anymore. We want a real king. Everybody else around us has a real king. They have a throne that they can look to. We do not have that, and we want to be like everyone else. Samuel, of course, gets frustrated at this, and he takes his frustrations to God, and God says, give the people what they're asking for. They are not rejecting you, Samuel. They are rejecting me as their king. But tell them what a human king will be like. So Samuel goes and he says, listen, guys, a human king is not everything you think it's going to be. A human king will demand your children as their servants. A human king is going to require you to give them a portion of all of your crops so that they can survive, so that their household can survive. They're going to take your children and your servants as their soldiers because they're going to need a continual rank of armies around them. This is what a king is going to require of you. They're going to take your land. And the people said, no, this is what we want. We want a king to fight for us. That part just kills me every time because I just want to say, excuse me, what has been happening throughout all of your history? In Exodus, when they're facing the Red Sea and the army is coming against the people of Israel, the people are told, you need only to stand still, the Lord will fight for you. And they cross the Red Sea and the army behind them is shattered. Multiple times in the Judges, when they come across foreign lands, and Joshua, when they're getting ready to go into the Promised Land, they go into battle after battle after battle, and every time they are told the Lord will fight for us. The Lord has never ceased to fight for them. They have never not had a king fighting for them. But they want a human king. So they say, give us a human. And God selects Saul from among them. Now, Saul initially did not want to be king. In fact, when they go through the selection process to find God's anointed king, they come to Saul and he's hiding in the baggage. Now, Saul had already been told that God was going to do this, but he wasn't looking forward to it. And he stands up out of the baggage and he stands a head above everybody else, and everybody says, oh yes, this is a good choice. This is who we want. And this is who God has chosen. So Samuel anoints Saul as king. Saul begins by following God's command maybe once. He goes into his first battle with God's blessing, and he is successful. Now, one of the things that the people had been warned about when Samuel said, these are all the things that a human king will do, God also said that in that day you will call on my name and I will not answer you. Because up until this point there had been this pattern of them being in trouble and calling on God, and he would protect them because that was his job. He was the king. The king protects his people. And God says, if I am no longer your king, it is no longer my job to answer your cries for help. So Saul is king, and he begins to go into battles. And when he seeks God's wisdom, God comes with him. But it is not very long before he ceases to seek God's wisdom. He begins to take on the role of priest for himself, which he was not told to do. He begins to make his own decisions about what battles to go into. And things start to fall apart. And at one point, God gives Saul, through Samuel, a specific instruction to go into battle against these Amalekites. It's a people group. To go against the Amalekites and to destroy everything. Don't leave a single person, a single animal. Everything is to be destroyed. Now, to human understanding, this feels wasteful. In our modern day, this actually feels really cruel. Why would God give them this instruction? But the truth that we need to understand is that God is above time and space. God sees everything, and he knows the consequences for his people if the Amalekites survive. If even one of the Amalekites survives, he knows what the consequence is. He does not want even a root of this people group to survive. Saul goes into battle, and he takes as prisoner the king of the Amalekites. A prisoner is not dead. He takes him as prisoner really more as a trophy to say, look, I have conquered this king. Not only that, but he leaves alive the best animals, because why would you destroy those? And Samuel comes to Saul and he says, "What is this that's happening?" And Saul says, "Oh no, we really meant this is for God. We saved these for God. We are going to sacrifice them to God." And he's told, "Does not God require obedience more than sacrifice?" And at that point, Saul is rejected as king because he is not obedient to God. He has not submitted himself to the leadership of God. God sends Samuel to anoint a new king. Now, Saul doesn't know this part yet. Samuel goes and he finds the family of Jesse, as he is instructed to do. And he sees Jesse's sons lined up, these big masculine men. And Samuel says, "Yes, God has sent us to the right place." And he looks at the first son and he says, "Oh, he looks like a king." And God says, "Nope, that's not the one." And we do this for every single son. And God says, "Man looks on the outside, but I'm looking at the heart. There's still one more." So they go and find the youngest son, the one who isn't even considered important enough to show up to family meetings, out in the fields as a shepherd. They bring him in, and God says, "This is the one. This is the one after my own heart." Samuel anoints him as king. Now, we as the reader don't know anything really about David at this point, other than that God has chosen him. But we will soon see why. So Saul is still actually the king. He's the acting king on the throne. They go into battle against the Philistines, one of their fiercest rivals. And the Philistines bring with them a giant. Now, if we recall, Saul was the tallest one among the Israelites, but Goliath towers over him. And he is scared, and everyone is scared. Now, if we recall, a king's job was to protect his people. But where is Saul during this time when they're being continually challenged by the giant of the Philistines? Saul is back in his tent. He is not even interested. He is not going to go up against this giant. Nobody in Israel is going to go up against this giant because they see themselves as soldiers of Saul. And if Saul is scared, they are scared. David, the shepherd boy, comes in to bring some lunch to his brothers, who are actually the big, strong men on the battlefield. David comes just in time to hear the daily taunt from Goliath. Goliath every day has been coming out and telling the people, calling out a warrior to fight him. And every day, oh, I forgot to underline it. There he says, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." David hears this, and he looks around shocked. How are they standing for this? David asks them, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now, Goliath says, "I defy the ranks of Israel. Are you not servants of Saul?" And David says, "We are servants of God, and why are we allowing this? Who is he to defy the ranks of God?" Now, it may be that most of Israel at this time was not accepting of God as their king. It may be that they didn't feel they had a king to fight for them until they had one on the throne. But David understood that they have always had God fighting for them, and that they are still the armies of the Lord. They're not the armies of Saul. So David goes before Goliath without armor because he didn't have any to fit him, with just 5 stones and a sling. And he says, this is the part that gets me every time. Well, first we'll start with Goliath. Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." But David says, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines to this day, to the birds of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." David says it doesn't matter what weapon I have in my hand, because the only weapon that's fighting for me is up in heaven. God is my weapon. You have a sword and a spear. I have God. You think you're going to feed my body to the birds, but I'm going to feed the entire army through my God. David does not defeat Goliath. 5 stones and a sling do not defeat Goliath. God defeats Goliath, and David knows it. This is a man that is after God's own heart, and this is a man that God has chosen to lead his people. But it's not his time yet. So we see this first example. We have a very distinct contrast between Saul, who cowers in fear in his tent, and David, who understands that it's God who's fighting. That the battle doesn't rest on the shoulders of David. The battle didn't rest on the shoulders of Saul. The battle rested in God's hands, and God can defeat them. That is our first very distinct contrast between these two men, that at the time have both been anointed to be king, although only one knows that. So over time, as Saul begins to feel threatened by David, he begins to seek David's life. He wants to destroy David because the people are turning against him, and he sees the threat that is in David. And he begins to seek David to kill him and chase him all around the country. And David continues to flee for a few years. He gathers up an army of men that run around with him. A couple of different times he is given an opportunity to kill Saul. But David still understands that God is on the throne and that God has anointed Saul. And he continues to reject the notion of defying God. So as long as God's anointed is on the throne, David will not pursue that. So to protect his own life, feeling he has no chance should he return home to Israel, no chance against against King Saul, his king that should be protecting him, he goes to a place where Saul will never look for him, among the Philistines. He goes and he meets a king there named Achish, who gives a city named Ziklag to David and his 600 men, and there they establish their homes. They have their wives and their children. They live there for over a year, and in that time they go out making various raids on other people groups. And then at one point the Philistines prepare to go into battle, and David and his men come to join them. Now the Philistines are going into battle against the Israelites. And first we see Saul preparing for this battle. Saul's preparation for the battle means going to a witch and asking the spirit of Samuel, who has been dead now for several years, what he should do. Did Saul ask God? No. Saul summoned the spirit of a dead priest That act in itself was defying God to ask what he should do because he didn't know. And he still didn't know who to ask. That was Saul's response to go into this battle. David is with the Philistines, and he prepares to go into battle against his own people with the enemies of his people. And the leader of the Philistines sees David and says, No, I've heard of this one. The Israelites still praise him and his victories in battle, and I don't feel that we are safe going into battle against the Israelites with this man of Israel on our side. I don't want him with us. Send him home. So David and his men go home to Ziklag, the city that they've been given, and they find it destroyed and burned, and their women and their children have been taken. And they cry out in anguish. Not only have they been taken, but they've been taken by the Amalekites, the very people that Saul refused to wipe out when he was told. So the women and children have all been taken prisoner. Their city is burned. These women and children include 2 of David's wives at this point. Their city is burning, and the men are rising up against David. Because when you are grieving, you blame whoever is close. So they see it as David's fault, because if they hadn't been following David, they wouldn't be in this land of the enemy. They rise up to stone David, and so now here we find David in this place where he has been running for his life endlessly from the king that should be protecting him. He has been forced into the land of his enemies, out of his own homeland, because he does not feel safe there. The only men that he has been able to rally with him are now against him and ready to stone him. Any lesser man in this position would have faltered completely. Saul, we know, would have fell apart completely. He would have found a place to hide again. Whether it's in the baggage or in his tent, Saul would be hiding. David, it says, right here in chapter 30 of 1 Samuel, it says, And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David's strength didn't come from a throne, it didn't come from a crown, and it didn't come from 600 men on his side. It came from God. And in that moment, a lesser man, in his hot-headedness and anger, would have immediately declared battle, because that's what his men would have wanted. To go avenge what they have lost. To go bring back what they have lost. But David first finds his strength in the Lord, and he calls for the priest and the ephod, and he prays to God and says, Shall I pursue after this band, and shall I overtake them? The instinct would have been to do it immediately. And David asked God what they should do. Now remember, just 2 chapters before, we saw what Saul did before he went into battle. He went to a witch. David went to God. David goes into battle against the Amalekites now and rescues his women and children. Not one of them was lost, and they bring them all back, and God has given him victory. At the same time, we have a split screen into another battle. Saul is battling the Philistines, the battle that David wasn't allowed to go to. And Saul loses his life in this battle, which we can also see as God's blessing, because God protected David from being in that battle where Saul would eventually lose his life. David wasn't anywhere near there, and he kept his hands clean of the anointed one of Israel. But David had a successful battle to rescue his people. Saul goes into battle and loses his life, and we can see very starkly the contrast between the way these 2 men lead. Saul has continually done what was right in his own eyes. Under the leadership of Saul, the people were no different than they were during the time of Judges, when everyone did what was right in the sight of their own eyes. They were trusting the eyes of men in Judges. And now, under the leadership of Saul, they're still trusting the eyes of one man, always doing right in what he considers to be right. David is continually seeking the Lord and doing what is right in the eyes of God. From this point, David does get to go on and become king because Saul has lost his life. And I would be remiss not to mention the fact that David, of course, was no perfect man. He was an example of a godly king. He was God's standard to say, look, it is possible for you to have a man on the throne that can come under my leadership. It is impossible, but not probable. So David is held up as a standard for a godly king. Not God himself, because God will always be the ultimate king. But David was as close as they could get to a godly king on earth. And he was not perfect. He did falter. He had an affair with Bathsheba. He murdered Bathsheba's husband. He made very big mistakes. But we saw that when Saul made a mistake, when he sinned against God, and Samuel came to confront him, Saul said, no, it's fine. It's fine. When David sins against God and is confronted by Nathan, David is broken. He weeps for what he has done. He weeps for the way that he has sinned against God. He mourns and he repents. No human being will ever be perfect. Every human will falter. Every human on any throne will always fail in one way or another. Some do it in many ways. Some do it in a few. But every single human will fail. It is not whether or not we can find someone perfect. It is not whether or not we can be perfect. It is what we do in the face of our failures. David found strength in the Lord. David repented. David is continually seeking God, and that is what makes him a man after God's own heart, which means that he's continually pursuing the heart of God. So we see after David, his son Solomon becomes king. Solomon establishes the temple as God had promised he would do. God had also made a promise to David that David would always have a descendant on the throne of Israel because of his faithfulness. So Solomon, we know, is known for two things, for his wisdom and his women. He was very wise as given by God, but he also loved his women, and that was his great downfall. And because of his failure to choose wives, or even a wife that honored God and would raise up his children to honor God, the kingdom falls. The kingdom divides after Solomon. His son takes the throne over Judah. Another man takes the throne over the rest of Israel. And from this point on, we follow two different timelines. Well, two lineages. Okay, not even lineages. The kingdom of Judah is one lineage. That all comes from David. The kingdom of Israel is a hot mess. It is one man after another, fighting for the throne, trying to get the throne. They have 19 kings. And have a span of, I forget the number now, about 100 years. David's line has 20 kings in about 400 years. It's a mess. And when we look at all of these kings listed, every time we see in 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, it tells us the name of the next king and the next king and the next king, and it introduces us to the king. It tells us his name, it tells us where he came from, and it says one of two things: that he did what was right in the sight of God. Again, notice, in the eyes of God, not the eyes of man. That he did what was right in the eyes of God and followed in the footsteps of David. Or he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, much more often than not, it was evil that won. Of those 39 kings that we have over the span of the two kingdoms, only 5 of them do what was right in the sight of the Lord. In fact, none of them in Israel. The ones that do right in the sight of the Lord are all in Judah. And even that is 5 out of 20. The odds of a man being trusted in the throne of God and succeeding are not in our favor. The kingdom of God was never intended to be trusted in the hands of man. It was never intended to look like the kingdoms of the world with a human king on the throne. God established it to look like a human kingdom so that people could understand and recognize what he was doing, but it was always intended to be different. And he was meant to be their king. They were never meant to have a human lead them. That was not what God intended. And man is not capable of bearing up that weight. It was always meant to be God, fighting for them, leading them, protecting them. So their experiment of a human king has failed miserably. And in time, both of the kingdoms that have now split off are taken over by enemy kingdoms. God wipes out the lineage of kings for a time. He promises, because he promised to David that he would always have a descendant on his throne. And he does promise that one will come back, but for a time, for the rest of the Old Testament, they do not have that. For the time between the Old Testament and Jesus, they don't have a king on the throne of Israel. They get to go back into Israel after their time of exile. It's a little bit of a timeout, and we'll study that next week. But there is no more king on a throne in Israel. They've challenged God's kingdom, and they've lost. So next week we'll go into what the prophets had to say about a coming kingdom, reminding the people of what God intended for his people so that they would be ready when he brought a new kind of king. So I look forward to joining you again next week. Go through the worksheets, do some study on your own, and come back here next week and we can study together. Thanks, guys.